At 75 years old, sitting in my small apartment overlooking the Kansas plains where my nightmare began, I can still taste the metallic flavor of blood mixed with dirt from that July morning in 1958 when I was 8. The memory arrives with the clarity that only trauma can provide, every detail preserved like insects in amber, waiting to surface when I least expect them. That morning, I crouched behind our barn's rotting door, watching my father Frank's calloused fist connect with my mother's jaw. The sound, wet sharp final, echoed off the empty grain bins that hadn't held corn in 3 years. Margaret McBride crumpled to the hay-strewn floor, her tuberculosis cough mixing with fresh blood that dripped steadily onto the straw beneath her. "Please, Frank," she wheezed, pressing one trembling hand to her split lip. "Sarah's just 8. She didn't know the milk bucket had a hole. 8 years old and still useless as tits on a bull." My father snarled, his work boots planted wide in the doorway. The drought had killed our last 3 harvests, and the foreclosure notice nailed to our front door made his rage sharper than usual. "We got no money for her mistakes. No money for anything." I pressed deeper into the shadows, my empty stomach cramping with hunger. We'd eaten nothing but watery bean soup for 4 days straight. The general store had cut off our credit 2 months ago, and Dr. Harrison wouldn't come out to treat Mama's worsening cough unless we paid cash upfront money we didn't have and never would. Through a gap in the barn boards, I watched my mother struggle to sit up, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. At 32, she looked 50. The consumption was eating her alive from the inside, and my father's fists were finishing the job from the outside. "She's trying her best," Mama whispered, blood speckling the words. "We all are." Frank's laugh was bitter as burned coffee. "Best, this is what best gets us." He gestured around our failing farm, the broken windmill, the empty chicken coop, the fields of cracked earth where corn should have been growing tall. 60 acres of dust and debt, a sick wife who can't keep house, a daughter who breaks more than she fixes. That night, after he passed out drunk in his chair, I knelt beside Mama's mattress with strips torn from my own dress, cleaning her wounds by candlelight. Her skin felt paper-thin under my small fingers, burning with fever that no amount of cold creek water could break. "Mama," I whispered, dabbing blood from her swollen lip. "When will Papa stop being so angry?" She looked at me with eyes that had once been cornflower blue, but now seemed faded like fabric left too long in the sun. Her hand found mine, squeezing with what little strength remained in her bird-bone fingers. "Some people carry so much hurt inside them, baby girl, that it spills out on everyone around them. Your Papa? He wasn't always like this. The farm was his daddy's and his daddy's before that. Losing it is killing him slow, as my cough is killing me." I didn't understand then that she was preparing me for battles I couldn't yet imagine. All I knew was that the taste of fear and blood had become as familiar as the dust that coated everything we owned, and that somewhere in the darkness beyond our failing farm, worse things were waiting. The thunder that rolled across the plains that night seemed to carry a warning I was too young to interpret. But now, 67 years later, I know it was the sound of my childhood ending, not with the innocent passage of time, but with the brutal efficiency of a fist connecting with flesh, teaching me that the world was a place where the strong destroyed the weak, and survival meant learning to hide in shadows until you were strong enough to fight back. By 1960, when I turned 10, I had become the fragile backbone holding our dying household together. Cedar Falls, Kansas was the kind of town that existed purely by geographical accident. 300 souls scattered across wheat fields that hadn't produced a decent crop since Eisenhower took office. Our nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, lived 4 miles down a dirt road that turned to impassable mud every time it rained. Our farmhouse, built by my grandfather in 1923, leaked in 8 different places and had no running water. Every morning before dawn, I hauled galvanized buckets from our hand pump well, my thin arms burning with effort as I lugged 40 pounds of water across the yard. Inside, Mama lay propped against pillows that reeked of medicinal coal tar, and the sweet, sick smell of tuberculosis, her breathing a constant rattle that never let me forget death was camping in our front parlor. My father had given up farming after the bank repossessed our tractor and most of our equipment. Now, he worked 12-hour shifts at Morrison's grain elevator 20 miles away in the county seat, coming home each evening, covered in wheat dust, and radiating the kind of rage that comes from watching your birthright slip through your fingers like sand. Well, $17.50, he announced one October evening, dumping his weekly pay envelope on our kitchen table. The bills, mortgage payment, medical supplies for Mama, heating oil for winter added up to $32. How the hell are we supposed to live on this? I learned to read the signs of his brewing violence like a farmer reads weather. The way his jaw muscles twitched when he counted money. The particular silence that fell over the house when collection notices arrived. The sound his knuckles made when he cracked them, preparing for the release that only came through his fists. On his worst nights, when the whiskey made him remember every crop failure and every unpaid bill, I'd grab Mama's medicine bottles and hide in the barn until his fury burned itself out. The old grain storage bins made perfect hiding spots, their metal walls muffling sound while providing clear views of the house through rust holes. School became my sanctuary, though I missed more days than I attended. Cedar Falls Elementary sat 2 miles from our farm, and the walk took me past abandoned homesteads whose owners had given up and moved to California or Detroit, chasing factory jobs and the promise of steady wages. Mrs. Henley, my 4th-grade teacher, asked about my frequent absences with genuine concern creasing her round face. Family difficulties. I'd mumble, sliding into my desk with hay still clinging to my patched dress. The truth that I'd spent the morning cleaning blood from my mother's face or hiding in the root cellar while my father raged seemed too large and dangerous to speak aloud. My classmates whispered about the McBride girl who smelled like poverty and never brought lunch to school. At recess, I'd sit alone under the playground's single oak tree, watching normal families prepare for church socials and community picnics. Their children laughed without looking over their shoulders, ran without fear of accidentally breaking something valuable, spoke without calculating whether their words might trigger an adult's anger. "Sarah's mama is real sick," I overheard Jenny Patterson tell her friends one afternoon. "My mama says she's not long for this world, and then what'll happen to that poor girl?" What would happen, I wondered, lying awake at night, listening to my mother's labored breathing and my father's drunken snoring, was something I couldn't let myself think about. Instead, I focused on immediate survival, stretching our meager food supplies, keeping house, while Mama rested, staying invisible when Papa's temper flared. But even then, at 10 years old, I was beginning to understand that escape would eventually become necessary. I started hiding coins whenever I found them, pennies dropped by customers at Morrison's store, nickels discovered under cushions, when I cleaned house for Mrs. Patterson in exchange for leftover bread. My treasure, a tobacco tin buried beneath loose floorboards in the barn, contained 87 cents by Christmas of 1960. Not enough to change anything, but enough to represent hope that someday, somehow, I might have choices my parents never did. The world beyond our failing farm remained largely mysterious to me then, but I understood it contained possibilities, good and bad, that my current life couldn't imagine. I just didn't know that some of those possibilities were already hunting me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The summer of 1962 brought the first real excitement Cedar Falls had experienced since the Korean War ended. At 12 years old, I had grown tall and gangly, my auburn hair hanging past my shoulders, because we couldn't afford regular haircuts, my body beginning the awkward transition toward womanhood on a diet that barely sustained basic survival. The traveling carnival arrived on July 4th weekend, setting up in Memorial Park, with the kind of fanfare our town hadn't seen in decades. Colored lights strung between elm trees, the smell of cotton candy, and caramel apples drifting on the summer breeze, carousel music competing with the excited shouts of children who'd been counting pennies for weeks. Among the performers was a man calling himself Jolly Joe, a street entertainer in his early 40s who juggled rainbow-colored scarves while playing harmonica melodies that seemed to dance on the humid air. He had silver-streaked brown hair laugh lines around his eyes and the kind of easy smile that made adults dig deeper into their pockets for tips. To my 12-year-old eyes, he represented everything magical about the world beyond Cedar Falls. I discovered him on a scorching Tuesday afternoon after finishing my chores. Mama had fallen into one of her deep fever-driven sleeps, and Papa wouldn't return from the grain elevator until after sunset. For the first time in months, I had several hours of freedom stretching before me like an unexpected gift. Memorial Park buzzed with activity. Families spread blankets on the grass for impromptu picnics. Children shrieked with joy on the makeshift tilt-a-whirl. Teenagers flirted near the ring toss game while their parents gossiped in the shade. I stood at the park's edge, watching this display of normal family life, with the fascination of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. That's when Joe noticed me, a solitary girl in a faded yellow dress, observing his performance from beneath the oak tree, where I'd spent so many lonely recesses. When his routine ended and the small crowd dispersed, he approached me with 3 juggling balls in his weathered hands. "What's your name, sweetheart?" His voice was warm, practiced with a slight accent I couldn't identify. "Sarah," I replied, suddenly conscious of my unwashed hair and the patches on my dress. "Sarah's a beautiful name for a beautiful girl. Tell me, Sarah, do you like magic?" I nodded, mesmerized. No adult had ever spoken to me with such kindness. "I've got a very special trick," he continued, glancing casually around the park. "But it's a secret, can't perform it where everyone can see, or they'd all want to learn it. Would you like to see real magic?" My heart hammered with excitement as he led me away from the crowd past the game booths and food stands toward a cluster of wild shrubs at the park's eastern edge, where the manicured grass gave way to prairie. The transition from public space to isolated wilderness happened gradually, first fewer families, then scattered teenagers, then just us walking through increasingly tall grass toward what looked like a perfect place for a private magic show. "Now," he said when we reached a small clearing surrounded by sumac bushes, "you have to promise this stays our special secret." Before I could respond, his hands were on me. The transformation happened so quickly, I couldn't process it. One moment, I was anticipating wonder. The next, I was pinned beneath his weight on the rough ground, his palm pressed hard against my mouth to muffle my screams. The scent of wild honeysuckle, which had seemed magical moments before, now mixed with his sweat and the metallic taste of my own blood as I bit my tongue, trying to breathe. The assault lasted 14 minutes. I know because I could hear the courthouse clock chiming 3:15 when it began, and 1/2 when he finally rolled away from my torn, bleeding body. The physical pain was immediate and overwhelming, a burning, tearing sensation that made me curl into a protective ball, gasping for air between sobs that came from somewhere deeper than my lungs. "You tell anyone about our special game?" He whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "And I'll come back for your sick mama. I know where you live, Sarah. I know all about your family's troubles. One word to anyone, and I'll make sure those troubles get much worse." He straightened his clothes with casual efficiency, ran his fingers through his hair to remove grass and leaves, then walked back toward the carnival as if nothing had happened. Through the gaps between bushes, I could see families still enjoying their holiday celebration, children chasing fireflies, parents laughing over shared meals, teenagers holding hands in the twilight. I lay there until full darkness fell my torn dress, sticking to wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, trying to understand what had just occurred. The sounds of the carnival continued in the distance, calliope music, bursts of laughter, the calls of vendors closing their booths for the night, but they seemed to come from another universe entirely. When I finally found strength to stand, every step sent fresh waves of agony through my body. I stumbled home through backfields, avoiding roads where someone might see me arriving at our farmhouse just as my father's truck pulled into the yard. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, climbing down from the cab with the careful movements of a man who'd been drinking. "Your mama's been asking for you." "Just walking?" I managed my voice barely audible. He studied my face with bloodshot eyes, taking in my pale complexion and the way I favored my left side. "You look like hammered hell. Don't bring whatever sickness you picked up into this house. We got enough problems without you adding more." I nodded and escaped to my corner of the attic, where I finally allowed myself to cry, muffling sobs in my thin pillow, while the taste of his hand lingered in my mouth, and every movement reminded me of what he'd stolen from me in those 14 minutes. That night marked the end of whatever innocence I'd managed to preserve through 2 years of watching my father's violence and my mother's slow death. But it also planted something else in the devastated landscape of my childhood, a seed of rage that would eventually grow into something powerful enough to bring down the monster who'd planted it. The weeks following my assault became a careful choreography of hidden suffering and mounting terror. The physical injuries were severe internal tearing that led to infections, bruising that painted my torso in shades of purple and black, and constant pain that made even simple tasks feel like climbing mountains. Without access to medical care or antibiotics, the infections festered, causing fever spikes that left me dizzy and nauseous. I had to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my body betrayed me at every turn. During breakfast, I'd grip the edge of our wooden table to keep from swaying as fever made the kitchen spin around me. When Papa ordered me to milk our cow, Betsy, I'd bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep from crying out as the motion aggravated my injuries. "You're moving like an old woman," he observed one August morning, his bloodshot eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What's wrong with you now?" "Nothing," I lied, forcing myself to stand straighter despite the knife-sharp pain in my abdomen. "Just tired." Tired. His coffee mug slammed against the table, making me flinch involuntarily. "You think you got reasons to be tired? I break my back 10 hours a day at that godforsaken elevator while you play around town like some spoiled princess?" His hand connected with my cheek in a sharp crack that sent stars exploding across my vision. I stumbled backward, tasting fresh blood where my teeth cut the inside of my mouth, the same metallic flavor that had haunted me since July 4th. "Frank, please," Mama called weakly from her bed in the next room. "She's still just a child." "Ah, child my ass," he snarled. "She's old enough to pull her weight around here instead of acting like the world owes her something." The slap had reopened a cut on my lip that hadn't fully healed from the assault. I felt warm blood trickling down my chin, and my father's expression shifted from anger to disgust when he noticed it. "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you? You're bleeding all over my clean kitchen." I mumbled something about accidentally biting my tongue and hurried outside to our hand pump, where I splashed cold water on my face and watched pink streams run into the dust at my feet. In the warped reflection of the pump's metal surface, I saw a stranger hollow-eyed, gaunt, with finger-shaped bruises on my throat that my collar couldn't quite hide. School became a minefield I couldn't successfully navigate. The infections left me running constant low-grade fevers that made concentration impossible. During arithmetic, numbers would blur together on the chalkboard. In reading class, I'd stare at the same paragraph for 10 minutes without processing a single word. Mrs. Henley noticed immediately. "Sarah, are you feeling all right? You look pale as a ghost." "I'm fine," I insisted, though my voice sounded hoarse and strained even to my own ears. But my classmates noticed, too, their whispers following me across the playground like smoke. "Something's real wrong with the McBride girl. My mama says she's been acting strange, walking funny. Probably caught something from all that filth they live in. Maybe it's catching. Maybe we should stay away." The social isolation that had existed due to our poverty deepened into something more sinister. Children who had simply ignored me before now actively avoided me as if whatever was wrong with me might be contagious. I began eating my meager lunches alone in the school library, grateful for the quiet sanctuary and the escape into books about places where people lived in houses with indoor plumbing and fathers who didn't use their fists to solve problems. The infections reached their peak during a late summer thunderstorm that turned our farm into a muddy swamp. I was feeding our chickens when the fever spiked, suddenly making the world tilt sideways. I came to lying face down in the mud, rain soaking through my clothes and chickens pecking curiously at my hair. I managed to crawl to the barn where I huddled in an empty horse stall, shaking with fever and pain. Lightning illuminated the interior in stark black and white, and in one of those brief bright moments, I caught sight of myself in a broken mirror, propped against the wall. A ghost of the girl I'd been 2 months ago, all sharp angles and hollow shadows. That night, as thunder shook the rafters and rain drummed against the roof, I made a decision that would shape every day of my remaining life. I would survive this. I would survive him, survive my father's rage, survive the poverty and isolation and pain. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I would. I found clean rags in Mama's sewing basket and did my best to tend my wounds. We kept veterinary antiseptic for the animal's harsh stuff that burned like liquid fire when I applied it to my injuries, but it was all we had. I gritted my teeth and used it anyway, knowing that infection could kill me just as surely as my father's fists or Joe's violence. The fever broke 3 days later, leaving me weaker but alive. More importantly, it left me with a clarity I'd never possessed before. Joe had threatened to hurt my mother if I told anyone about our special game, but I was beginning to understand that keeping his secret was destroying me from the inside out. I needed help, but I also needed to be smart about getting it. Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the neighboring farm, had always been kind to me. She occasionally hired me to help with canning or cleaning in exchange for leftover food, and she'd never asked too many questions about the bruises that sometimes marked my arms. If I could find the right words, careful words that wouldn't trigger Joe's threats, maybe she would know what to do. The first battle against the infection and fever had been won, but I was beginning to realize that this war would require allies if I had any hope of surviving it. As autumn of 1962 faded into what would prove to be the harshest winter in Kansas history, the multiple traumas of my young life began compounding like interest on a debt that could never be repaid. The assault had left me with chronic health problems that no 12-year-old should have to navigate, recurring infections that flared without warning, digestive issues that made eating painful, and a bone-deep fear of physical contact that turned normal human interaction into an ordeal. My father's drinking had escalated following yet another layoff. Morrison's grain elevator had installed new automated systems, eliminating half their workforce in a single day. At 54, Frank McBride was considered too old and too set in his ways for most available jobs. His rage, previously divided between our circumstances and his personal failures, now focused entirely on my mother and me. The winter of 1962 to 63 brought blizzards that buried our house in 12-foot snowdrifts and temperatures that dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Our wood supply, which should have lasted until spring, was nearly exhausted by January because our house had more gaps than insulation. "Get out there and split more wood," Papa ordered one February morning, gesturing toward the axe beside our kitchen door. Ice had formed on the inside of our windows, and I could see my breath in the frigid air inside our own house. "The pile's almost gone," I said carefully, knowing that contradicting him was dangerous, but hoping logic might prevail. "Maybe we should save what's left for cooking and just heat one room." His backhand caught me across the jaw, snapping my head to the side and filling my mouth with the familiar metallic taste of blood. "Don't tell me how to manage my own house. Get out there and split wood until I tell you to stop." Outside, the wind cut through my threadbare coat like frozen razors. The woodpile, which had once reached my chest, was now barely knee-high. I raised the heavy axe with numb fingers and brought it down on a frozen log, the impact jarring my arms and sending splinters flying across the snow. Each swing was agony. The chronic pain from my injuries made any physical exertion excruciating, and the cold amplified every ache until I felt like my bones might shatter from the effort. I worked for 4 hours, splitting every remaining piece of wood we owned until my hands were bleeding through my mittens and my shoulders screamed in protest. When I finally stumbled back inside, Papa was passed out in his chair, an empty whiskey bottle rolling on the floor beside his feet. Mama watched from her bed with eyes that had once been bright blue, but now seemed faded, like old denim washed too many times. "Come here, baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her labored breathing. I knelt beside her mattress, and she pulled me close with arms that felt like kindling wrapped in paper. Her body burned with fever despite the cold, and her nightgown was soaked with sweat. "I'm dying, Sarah," she said simply as if discussing the weather. "We both know it. The question is what happens to you when I'm gone." "Mama don't talk like that." "Listen to me." Her grip on my arm tightened with surprising strength. "I've been thinking about your mama's people, the McKays. My brother David moved to California before you were born. If something happens to me, you could maybe find him get away from here." She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper letters, tied with a faded ribbon, yellowed with age and handling. "These are from my family, from before I married your father. David's address might be old, but it's a place to start. Promise me you'll remember that you have choices. Promise me you won't let this place kill your spirit like it's killing mine." I promised, though. I couldn't imagine how a 12-year-old girl with no money and no connections could possibly make it to California. Spring brought fresh trauma when the annual county fair arrived in May. I was walking home from school when I heard the familiar sound of harmonica music drifting from the fairgrounds. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Joe was back performing for a new crowd of children with the same rainbow scarves and easy smile that had lured me to disaster 10 months earlier. Panic hit me like a physical blow. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, my breathing became shallow and rapid, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I turned and ran crashing through a group of women gossiping near the Methodist church booth, ignoring their cries of protest as I fled toward the woods behind the fairgrounds. I ran until my lungs burned and my infected wounds reopened, finally collapsing behind a fallen cottonwood where wild raspberry canes provided cover. There, I hyperventilated until unconsciousness claimed me, my body's way of protecting itself from trauma too overwhelming to process. I woke hours later to the sound of search parties calling my name through the gathering darkness. Mrs. Patterson found me first, her weathered face creased with worry. "Sarah, thank the Lord. Everyone's been looking for you. What happened, child?" I couldn't explain about Joe without revealing everything else. Instead, I mumbled something about feeling sick from the heat and let her lead me home where my father was waiting with his belt already in hand. "Running off like some wild animal," he snarled, the leather making a sharp crack as he snapped it. "Making me look like a fool in front of the whole town, having them organize search parties like you're somebody important." The beating was savage, even by his standards, 30 lashes across my back and legs, that left me unable to sit properly for 2 weeks. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of knowing that Joe was still out there, still performing for children, still hunting for victims. Each confrontation with my father's violence, each reminder of my assault, each day of grinding poverty, added another layer to the rage growing inside me. I was accumulating injuries faster than I could heal from them, but something harder was forming in my core. A determination forged in pain and tempered by injustice. By summer's end, I had managed to save $14.37 in coins hidden in a coffee can buried beneath the barn's loose floorboards. I earned the money by returning bottles for deposit, selling eggs from our few remaining chickens, and doing odd jobs for neighbors when Papa wasn't watching. It wasn't much, but it represented hope. Hope that someday I might have enough money to escape enough to survive on my own, enough to make the people who had hurt me pay for what they'd done. But first, I had to survive one more winter in a house where love had frozen to death and only violence remained to keep us warm. My mother died on March 15, 1963, during the worst blizzard Kansas had seen since the Dust Bowl years. I was 13, and she had been bedridden for 8 months, her tuberculosis entering its final stages with alarming speed. But what she revealed in her last lucid moments changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my assault, and the man who had destroyed my childhood. I was alone with her when the end came. Papa had passed out drunk in the kitchen after receiving another foreclosure notice, and the wind outside howled like something alive and angry, piling snow against our windows until we were essentially buried alive. Mama's breathing had become increasingly labored throughout the day, each inhalation a visible struggle that made her entire body convulse. "Sarah?" she whispered around noon, her voice barely audible above the storm. The old Bible, bottom drawer of my dresser, behind the leather binding. I found what she meant, a hidden pocket sewn into the Bible's back cover, containing a bundle of letters and a small photograph so old it was brown around the edges. The letters were tied with ribbon that had once been red, but had faded to rust-colored brown. The paper was brittle and the ink had faded, but I could still make out the handwriting and the signature that made my blood freeze. "Joseph McKay. He's my older brother." Mama gasped each word, costing her tremendous effort. "Your uncle. I recognized him at the carnival last summer, but I was too ashamed to tell you. Too afraid." The letters, postmarked between 1943 and 1946, told a story that explained everything and made it infinitely worse. Joseph McKay had been cast out of the family in 1944 after a series of increasingly serious assaults. First a hired girl who worked in my grandfather's store, then 2 neighbor girls, and finally a cousin from Missouri who had been visiting for harvest season. Rather than face criminal charges, my grandfather had paid money to the victims' families for their silence and banished Joseph with orders never to return to Kansas. But the letters revealed something that made my stomach clench with horror. Joseph's motivation for returning wasn't just general criminality. It was specific, calculated revenge against the family members who had inherited the farm he believed should have been his. Grandpa's will." Mama wheezed, pointing at one particular letter with a trembling finger. "Left everything to me instead of Joseph because of what he'd done. The farm, the land, the equipment. It should have gone to the eldest son, but Grandpa couldn't bear the thought of Joseph benefiting from his crimes." The photograph showed 3 children standing beside a farmhouse. I recognized our farmhouse, but 40 years younger. The tallest child, a boy of perhaps 16, had the same silver-streaked brown hair and calculating eyes that had haunted my nightmares since July. "He came back for revenge." Mama continued, struggling to stay conscious as her breathing became more labored. "He knew who you were, Sarah. Knew you were my daughter. What he did to you? It wasn't random. It was his way of getting back at me for inheriting what he thought belonged to him." The full horror of my assault crystallized in that moment. I hadn't been the victim of a random predator. I had been specifically targeted by my own uncle as a weapon in a family feud that had been brewing for nearly 20 years. The violation of my body had been Joseph's way of violating our family's honor, of taking from us what he felt we had stolen from him. "The carnival circuit," she whispered, her voice growing fainter. "He probably follows it, keeps track of us, knows when we're struggling, knows the farm is failing anyway." She was right. Among the letters was a more recent envelope postmarked just 6 months earlier from Topeka. Inside was a newspaper clipping about farm foreclosures in Butler County, with our family's name highlighted in pencil. Joseph had been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Mama's final words were an apology that broke what remained of my heart. "I should have warned you, should have protected you." But I was so ashamed of what he was, of what our family had produced. I thought if I never spoke his name, he'd stay gone forever. She died as the courthouse clock struck 3 in the afternoon, her hand going limp in mine, as the candle on her nightstand guttered out, leaving me alone in the darkness with the knowledge that my own blood had betrayed me in the cruelest possible way. I sat with her body until dawn, reading and rereading the letters by candlelight, memorizing every detail of Joseph McKay's crimes and banishment. The documents included addresses of his victims, dates of incidents, even witness statements that my grandfather had collected as insurance against Joseph's return. It was a complete record of his violent history, preserved by a man who had understood that evil, once unleashed, rarely stays contained. When Papa finally sobered up enough to realize what had happened, his first words weren't grief or comfort, but cold practicality. "Funeral costs money we don't have. We'll have to bury her ourselves." We dug Mama's grave in the family plot behind the house, chipping through 2 feet of frozen ground with pickaxes and shovels while the March wind cut through us like knives. I said my own words over her body, promising her spirit that Joseph McKay would pay for what he had done to both of us, to her, through the theft of her innocence, and security to me, through the deliberate destruction of my childhood. Papa died 3 weeks later in a drunken accident driving our tractor into a creek during a sudden thaw. The impact broke his neck, and he was found the next morning by a passing mail carrier, his eyes open and staring at the gray Kansas sky. At 13, I was an orphan with nothing but debts, a crumbling farmhouse, and terrible knowledge that transformed my understanding of everything that had happened to me. The bank foreclosed within a month, and I was turned out into the spring mud with 1 suitcase, Mama's letters, and my hidden coffee can containing $23.16. But I also had something else now, a name, a history, and a purpose that burned in my chest like swallowed fire. Joseph McKay had used me to settle his accounts with the dead, but I was very much alive, and I intended to show him the difference between a helpless child and a young woman with nothing left to lose. The game he had started in Memorial Park was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The spring and summer of 1963 nearly destroyed me. At 13, homeless and completely alone, I made my way to Wichita with nothing but Mama's letters, $23, and a burning desire for justice that had to compete with the immediate demands of survival. The city was brutal to a girl with no legal guardian, no documentation, and no understanding of how urban life functioned. I slept wherever I could find shelter, abandoned buildings where rats scurried across sleeping bodies, steam grates that left geometric burns on my skin, and when I was extremely fortunate, the basement of Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where Father Kowalski would sometimes look the other way if he found stragglers huddled behind the boiler after morning mass. Hunger became a constant companion that gnawed at my stomach and made my hands shake with weakness. I learned to scavenge from restaurant dumpsters just after closing time, competing with stray dogs and other desperate souls for scraps of spoiled food. The bakery on Market Street threw out day-old bread every Wednesday morning, and I would wait in the alley from 5 a.m. onward to claim my share, sometimes fighting grown men for a moldy loaf that might sustain me for 3 days if I rationed it carefully. Work was nearly impossible to find for a girl with no fixed address, no references, and a wariness of adult men that made potential employers uncomfortable. I managed occasional day labor, scrubbing floors in office buildings for 50 cents, washing dishes at diners for leftover food sorting bottles at the recycling plant for 25 cents an hour, but never enough consecutive employment to afford even the cheapest boarding house room. The physical dangers were constant and immediate. Wichita in 1963 was a rough town for anyone, but particularly brutal for unprotected children. Predators of all kinds hunted the streets looking for easy prey among the homeless and desperate. I learned to carry a broken bottle in my coat pocket and to sleep with my back against walls, always ready to run. The worst incident came during a July heat wave that left the city sweltering in 100-degree temperatures. I had found temporary shelter in an abandoned warehouse where several other homeless people had gathered, seeking relief from the oppressive sun. I was dozing against a concrete pillar when I was awakened by voices 3 men who had been drinking and were looking for entertainment. "Look what we got here!" The largest one said, his breath reeking of cheap wine and rotting teeth. "Little girl, all alone in the big city." I tried to run, but malnutrition had left me weak and slow. They caught me before I reached the warehouse door, their hands grabbing at my clothes and hair. The leader, a scarred man missing 2 fingers on his left hand, pinned me against the wall, while the others went through my few possessions. "No money," one of them complained, dumping out my cardboard suitcase. Mama's precious letters scattered across the dirty floor, and I watched in horror as the wind from broken windows began to blow them around the warehouse. "Guess we'll have to take payment another way." The third man leered, his hands reaching for my dress. What followed was a savage beating that left me unconscious for hours. They took my shoes, my coat, and the small knife I had been carrying for protection, but they stopped short of rape, perhaps because I looked so sickly and half dead that even they were disgusted. When I regained consciousness, blood was dried in my hair, and 3 of my ribs were cracked, making every breath an exercise in agony. But the worst damage was to Mama's letters. I crawled around the warehouse on hands and knees, collecting what pages I could find, but nearly a third were gone, blown away through broken windows or torn beyond repair. Those documents were my only proof of Joseph McKay's identity, and crimes my only evidence that could bring him to justice. Losing them felt like losing Mama all over again. The attack left me with injuries that never properly healed. Without medical care, my ribs set crooked, creating a permanent ache in my chest that flared whenever the weather changed. The head trauma gave me recurring headaches that could strike without warning, sometimes so severe they left me vomiting and unable to see clearly for hours. But perhaps worse than the physical damage was the social isolation that followed. Word spread quickly among the homeless community about the girl who had been targeted, and rather than sympathy, I found suspicion and avoidance. Some believed I had brought the attack on myself. Others worried that associating with me would make them targets too. Mrs. Kowalski, who ran a soup kitchen on the east side, was the only person who showed me consistent kindness during those dark months. She was a Polish immigrant in her 60s who had survived worse things than I could imagine, and she recognized something in my eyes that others missed. "You got fire inside you," she observed one evening as I helped her clean dishes in exchange for a bowl of soup. "Something that won't let you die even when dying would be easier. I seen it before in the old country. Some people, they got too much purpose to quit." She was right. Even as my body grew weaker and my circumstances more desperate, the rage that had sustained me since Mama's death continued to burn. Joseph McKay was out there somewhere, probably still performing for children, still hunting for new victims. Every day I survived was another day closer to finding him and making him pay. By autumn, I had found steady work at a commercial laundry that didn't ask too many questions about worker documentation. The pay was minimal 75 cents an hour for 10-hour shifts in stifling heat, but it was honest work that allowed me to rent a corner of a boarding house basement. 8 feet by 6 feet with a shared bathroom down the hall and no windows, but it was mine. I began planning, then using every free moment to piece together what remained of Mama's letters and to research ways of tracking a traveling performer. I wrote letters to newspapers in neighboring states, asking if they had covered carnivals featuring a juggler named Joe or Joseph. I haunted the public library, reading everything I could find about carnival circuit street performer networks and how entertainers moved from town to town. The search for Joseph McKay became the organizing principle of my life, the North Star that guided every decision and every step. I was no longer the terrified child he had assaulted in Memorial Park. I was becoming something harder, something that wouldn't stop until justice was served, no matter how long it took or what it cost me. 27 years passed before Joseph McKay made the mistake that delivered him back into my hands. 27 years of working factory jobs, night shifts at restaurants, and any other employment that would hire a woman with limited education and permanent wariness in her eyes. I had returned to Cedar Falls in 1990, now 40 years old, to take a position supervising the night crew at the new electronics assembly plant when fate gave me the opportunity I had been waiting for since I was 13. It was the 4th of July weekend, and Cedar Falls was celebrating its centennial with the largest festival in the town's history. I was walking home from my shift at 3 in the morning, exhausted from 12 hours of managing assembly line workers, when I heard the sound that had haunted my nightmares for nearly 3 decades, a harmonica playing "Oh Susanna" in the empty town square. There he was sitting on a bench beneath the same oak tree, where he had performed in 1962, now grayer, and moving with the stiffness of a man in his mid-60s, but unmistakably the same person who had destroyed my childhood. He wasn't performing. The festival wouldn't begin for hours, just playing melancholy tunes in the pre-dawn darkness, like some twisted nostalgia trip. I stood frozen in the shadows, watching him through different eyes than the terrified child of 1962. At 40, I was 5 feet 8 inches tall, hardened by decades of physical labor, and carrying the accumulated knowledge of someone who had spent 27 years planning for this exact moment. The fear was still there, but it was overpowered by something much stronger, cold, calculated rage. I waited until he finished his song and began packing his harmonica away, then stepped out of the shadows. Joseph McKay. He looked up, squinting at me in the dim light from the street lamps. For a moment, confusion flickered across his weathered features. Then recognition dawned, and his expression shifted to something like panic. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady. My name's Joe Collins, and I'm just passing through town." "Joseph McKay, that's your name?" I said, taking another step forward as my heart pounded. "My uncle. My mother was Margaret McKay McBride, and you destroyed my childhood at Memorial Park that July day in 1962. I was only 12. His face went pale, but he attempted to maintain the pretense. "You're crazy, lady. I never saw you before in my life." I reached into my purse and pulled out the surviving letters from Mama's collection pages that had been photocopied and stored in a safety deposit box for the past 15 years, along with additional documentation I had gathered through patient research. "I have proof, letters from my grandfather documenting your banishment from the family. Police reports from Missouri and Nebraska, witness statements, everything." Joseph's genial mask cracked completely then. The friendly street performer facade fell away, revealing the predator underneath. His eyes went flat and cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same menacing tone I remembered from that terrible day behind the bushes. "You persistent little bitch!" he snarled, rising to his feet with surprising agility for his age. "You should have kept your mouth shut all these years, should have been grateful I only hurt you once." The admission hit me like vindication and horror combined. "Why?" I demanded, my voice shaking with controlled fury. "Why me? Why did you come back?" "Because you people stole what was mine." His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the empty storefronts around the square. "That farm should have been mine by right. I was the eldest son. But no, they gave it to your precious mother instead, cast me out like a rabid dog because of a few farm sluts who couldn't keep their mouths shut." "Those sluts were children you assaulted," I said, stepping closer. "Girls you hurt just like you hurt me." "They were nothing," he screamed. "Just worthless farm trash. But your mother acted like she was better than me, like she deserved what should have been mine by birthright. So I took something from her that could never be replaced, her daughter's innocence." That's when he lunged at me with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Even at 64, Joseph was still strong from decades of manual labor and life on the road. His fist caught me across the jaw with enough force to snap my head back and fill my mouth with blood, but I had been expecting violence and was ready for it. 27 years of factory work had given me muscles he didn't expect, and 27 years of rage had given me motivation he couldn't match. I rolled with the punch and drove my knee upward, connecting solidly with his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping, and I grabbed him by his shirt and used his own momentum to send him stumbling backward. "You want to know what else you stole from my mother?" I shouted as he struggled to regain his balance. "You stole her peace of mind? She died knowing she had failed to protect me from her own brother." Joseph recovered faster than I expected and came at me again, this time with his hands extended like claws, aiming for my throat. I sidestepped and brought my elbow down hard on his collarbone, feeling something crack under the impact. He screamed in pain and fury and staggered away from me, clutching his shoulder. "I should have finished you that day in the park, should have made sure you never grew up to cause me trouble." "But you didn't," I said, advancing on him as he backed toward the street. And now it's too late. That's when I began to scream for help. "Police, somebody help, this man attacked me." Joseph's eyes went wide with panic as he realized his mistake. Fighting me in public, making threats where potential witnesses might hear admitting to decades-old crimes. In his rage, he had destroyed any chance of maintaining his Joe Collins identity. The night security guard from the bank came running first, followed by early shift workers from the diner across the street. Within minutes, we were surrounded by people who had heard the shouting and seen a man attacking a woman in the town square. "What's going on here?" demanded Officer Martinez, who had been patrolling downtown and responded to the commotion. "This man is Joseph McKay," I said, holding up the letters and documents that had somehow survived our struggle. "He's my uncle, and he assaulted me when I was 12 years old. These papers prove his identity and document his criminal history." Joseph tried to run, then pushing through the small crowd that had gathered, but his injured shoulder slowed him down, and there was nowhere to go in a town the size of Cedar Falls. Officer Martinez tackled him before he reached the street, and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful noise I had ever heard. As they loaded Joseph into the patrol car, he turned to look at me one last time through the rain-streaked window. The hate in his eyes was absolute, but so was the defeat. After 28 years, justice was finally being served. The show that had begun in Memorial Park in 1962 was finally truly over. The weeks following Joseph's arrest unfolded like a carefully choreographed legal ballet that I had been preparing for, consciously or unconsciously, for 28 years. The Butler County District Attorney's Office, led by prosecutor Ellen Hartman, took the case with unusual enthusiasm. After reviewing the extensive documentation I had accumulated over nearly 3 decades of patient investigation, Detective William Santos, a 20-year veteran of the force, interviewed me multiple times in the days following Joseph's arrest. Unlike the skeptical questioning I had feared, Santos treated my account with respect and thoroughness that suggested he understood the gravity of what we were dealing with. "I've been working sex crimes for 15 years, he told me during our third interview, "and I've never seen a case with this level of documentation going back so far. These letters your mother saved, combined with the research you've done, paint a picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning decades. The remaining letters from Mama's collection, despite their age, and the damage from my years of homeless desperation, provided crucial evidence. More importantly, Santos used them as a starting point for a broader investigation that uncovered a trail of victims stretching across the Great Plains. Working with law enforcement agencies in Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Oklahoma, they identified at least 12 other girls and women Joseph had assaulted between 1944 and 1989. "He's what we call a circuit predator," Santos explained. "Using carnival work and street performance as cover to move from town to town, always staying ahead of investigations that might connect his crimes. The aliases helped Joe Collins, Jimmy McKay, Joseph Martin, but his methods were consistent enough that we can establish clear patterns. 3 of Joseph's other victims were still alive and willing to testify. The first was Alice Brennan, now 52, and living in Lincoln, Nebraska. She had been 14 when Joseph assaulted her during a county fair in 1967, and her testimony was devastating in its similarity to my own experience. "He said the exact same things to me that he said to you," Alice testified during the preliminary hearing, her voice steady despite visible emotion. "About keeping it secret, about how no one would believe me if I told. He said he knew where I lived and would come back if I talked." The second victim, Linda Patterson from Oklahoma, had been only 10 years old when Joseph attacked her in 1971. Now 39 and working as a nurse in Tulsa, she provided details that corroborated the specific methods Joseph used to gain children's trust and isolate them from potential help. "He always had candy," Linda testified. "Always promised to show us something special, something magical. He made us feel chosen, important. Then he used that trust to hurt us in ways we didn't even have words for." The third survivor, Carol Hughes from Missouri, had been assaulted in 1985 at the age of 16. Her case was particularly significant because she had reported the crime to local police, but Joseph had disappeared before they could arrest him. The police report from that investigation provided official documentation of his methods and appearance that corroborated everything the other victims described. Joseph's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Thomas Bradley, attempted to discredit our testimonies by questioning why we had waited so long to come forward. His strategy backfired spectacularly when Prosecutor Hartman used it to highlight the systematic way Joseph had silenced his victims through threats and intimidation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hartman argued during her opening statement, "the defendant's own defense proves our point. These women didn't come forward because they were children when they were victimized. Children who were terrified into silence by a calculating predator who spent decades perfecting his techniques for controlling and silencing his victims." The trial lasted 3 weeks and attracted significant media attention. The story of the serial predator, who had used carnival work to hunt children across the Midwest, resonated with journalists and the public in ways I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, I found myself at the center of discussions about childhood sexual abuse, statute of limitations laws, and the long-term effects of trauma. The physical evidence from our fight in the town square supported my version of events completely. Joseph's knuckles were scraped from hitting me, while my injuries were consistent with defensive wounds rather than aggressive assault. Witnesses confirmed that I had called for help and that he had been making incriminating statements when they arrived. But the most damaging evidence against Joseph came from an unexpected source: his own possessions. When police searched his rooming house, they found journals dating back to the 1950s in which he had recorded detailed accounts of his assaults, including names, dates, locations, and descriptions of his victims that matched our testimonies with horrifying accuracy. He kept trophies, Detective Santos explained to me after reviewing the journals. Photographs, newspaper clippings about missing children, even items of clothing. It's like he was proud of what he'd done, like he wanted to preserve the memories. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: aggravated assault battery, multiple counts of sexual assault of a minor under new expanded statute of limitations laws, and kidnapping. Joseph McKay, at the age of 64, was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, sitting in the front row with Alice, Linda, and Carol, 4 survivors, united by shared trauma, but also by shared justice. When the judge pronounced the sentence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's death: peace. As the bailiff led Joseph away in handcuffs, he turned to look at us one final time. But there was no hatred in his eyes anymore, no defiance. Just the hollow recognition of a man who had finally been held accountable for decades of cruelty. The media attention that followed was intense, but ultimately positive. I gave several interviews hoping to encourage other survivors of childhood sexual assault to come forward, and worked with victim advocacy groups to push for expanded statute of limitations laws that would prevent other predators from escaping justice simply because their victims needed time to find their voices. My supervisor at the electronics plant, Janet Moore, was incredibly supportive throughout the trial, arranging for me to have flexible scheduling and access to counseling services through the company's employee assistance program. What you did took incredible courage, she told me after the sentencing. Not just coming forward, but surviving everything you went through to get to this point. You've helped a lot of people, Sarah, more than you probably realize. But courage wasn't how I thought about it. Justice seemed like a more accurate word. Justice delayed by 28 years, but justice nonetheless. The 12-year-old girl who had been broken in Memorial Park had grown into a woman capable of breaking her attacker in return. The show at long last was truly over. As I write these words today, in 2023, at the age of 75, sitting in the same modest apartment where I have lived for the past 20 years, I can see the Kansas plains stretching endlessly toward the horizon outside my window. The same vast sky that witnessed my childhood trauma now watches over my quiet retirement, and there is profound peace in that continuity. Joseph McKay died in prison in 2018, 7 years into his sentence. I learned of his death not from any official notification. I was not considered next of kin, but from a letter that arrived 2 weeks later, postmarked from the Kansas State Penitentiary, and signed by a corrections officer named Michael Torres. Nom, dear Ms. McBride. The letter began in careful handwriting. I was present during Joseph McKay's final hours, and I believe you have a right to know what happened before he died. According to Officer Torres, Joseph had been suffering from lung cancer for 8 months, a consequence of a lifetime of smoking that the prison medical system had been managing with palliative care. In his final weeks, as the morphine loosened his tongue and his grip on reality began to slip, he had begun confessing to crimes that went far beyond what he had been convicted for. He talked about girls he had hurt going back to the 1950s. Torres wrote, places I'd never heard of, names he sometimes couldn't remember clearly because there had been so many. But he kept coming back to you, kept saying your name over and over. Sarah McKay, he'd whisper during his lucid moments. She was the one who stopped me. She was the one who ended it. The letter continued with details that both chilled and vindicated me. In his final delirium, perhaps seeking some kind of absolution, or simply unable to contain decades of hidden guilt, Joseph had provided Torres with specific information about additional crimes and evidence, caches he had maintained throughout his predatory career. There are storage units in Topeka and Kansas City, Torres continued. Personal belongings and what he called his memory books. He gave me keys and locations before he died. I've already contacted the FBI, but I thought you should know that your decision to come forward probably helped solve crimes that families have been waiting for answers about for decades. The investigation that followed made national news. Joseph's memory books actually detailed journals and photograph albums stored in climate-controlled units documented 57 separate assaults over a 40-year period across 8 states. The FBI created a special task force to identify victims and notify families, some of whom had been searching for missing daughters and sisters since the 1960s. But the letter that truly changed the final chapter of my life arrived 9 months later in early 2019. It was from a woman named Rebecca McKay Chen, a forensic genealogist who had been working with law enforcement to identify some of Joseph's victims through DNA analysis. Dear Sarah, she wrote in elegant cursive that reminded me immediately of my mother's handwriting. I have been investigating the McKay family tree in connection with the Joseph McKay case, and I believe I am your half-niece. My father was David McKay, Joseph's younger brother, who left Kansas in 1963 and moved to California, where he started a new life. Rebecca's letter included photographs and documents that filled in decades of family history I had never known existed. David McKay, my mother's youngest brother, had been only 19 when Joseph was banished from the family. Horrified by his brother's crimes and ashamed of the McKay name, he had moved to Los Angeles, changed his surname to McKay Chen after marrying a Chinese-American woman, and raised his family with the assumption that all his Kansas relatives were dead. My father passed away in 2015, Rebecca continued, but before he died, he told me about a sister named Margaret, who had married a farmer named McBride. He always regretted losing touch with her, but he was afraid that contacting the family would somehow bring Joseph's shadow back into their lives. He carried guilt about her fate until the day he died. Rebecca had become a forensic genealogist, partly because of her family's hidden history, specializing in cold cases and helping families find closure through DNA analysis and genealogical research. When the Joseph McKay Task Force needed expert assistance tracking down victims and relatives, she had volunteered her services, never suspecting she would discover a living aunt. "I would very much like to meet you," she concluded, "not just because of family connection, but because I believe your skills in research and documentation could be invaluable in the work I do. There are many families out there still searching for answers, and your experience could help provide the closure you ultimately found." I called Rebecca that same evening, and we talked for 4 hours. She was 48, married to a software engineer with 2 college-age daughters who were studying criminal justice and social work respectively. Her voice carried the same musical cadence as my mother's, and when she laughed, which she did frequently, despite the serious nature of our conversation, I could hear echoes of Margaret McKay in the sound. We met in person 6 weeks later when Rebecca flew to Kansas for a conference on forensic genealogy. She brought with her a suitcase full of family photographs dating back to the 1890s, including pictures of my mother as a young woman that I had never seen. Looking through those photographs was like recovering lost pieces of my own identity. "You look exactly like her," Rebecca marveled, holding up a photo of Margaret taken around 1940. "Same eyes, same determined chin. Dad always said Margaret was the strongest person he knew, that she could survive anything life threw at her." More importantly, Rebecca brought me a proposition that would define the final chapter of my life. Would I consider partnering with her in her genealogical investigation work? The skills I had developed, tracking down Joseph's meticulous record-keeping patient research, the ability to piece together fragmentary evidence across decades, were exactly what cold case investigation required. "You have a gift for this work," she said, spreading crime scene photos and family trees across my kitchen table. "And I think it might be a way to transform your own trauma into something that helps other people find the peace you found." That conversation led to the most fulfilling period of my adult life. Over the past 4 years, Rebecca and I have worked together on hundreds of cases, helping families locate missing relatives, identifying remains found decades after disappearances, and providing closure to people who had given up hope of ever learning the truth about their loved ones. Our most significant success came 18 months ago, when we identified the remains of a young woman found in a creek bed in Missouri in 1987. Through DNA analysis and genealogical research, we determined she was Linda Patterson, not the Oklahoma Linda Patterson who testified at Joseph's trial, but a different Linda Patterson from Arkansas, who had been missing for 36 years. We located her surviving sister and provided details about Linda's final months that allowed the family to hold a proper funeral and finally begin the grieving process. "You gave us our sister back," Linda's sister told me during the phone call when we shared our findings, her voice thick with tears she had been holding back for more than 3 decades. "We never knew what happened to her, never knew if we should keep hoping or start grieving. Now we can finally say goodbye properly." That work has become my legacy, the way I chose to transform the worst experience of my childhood into something meaningful and healing. The investigative skills that Joseph McKay forced me to develop through his cruelty have become tools for bringing peace to other families shattered by violence and loss. I still live alone in my modest apartment, but I am no longer isolated. Rebecca visits several times a year, and her daughters, my great-nieces, call me Aunt Sarah, with genuine affection and respect. I have become part of a network of genealogists, law enforcement officers, and victim advocates connected by shared purpose rather than shared geography. The final surprise came just last month on my 75th birthday. Rebecca had driven up from Kansas City to celebrate with me, bringing homemade chocolate cake and a bottle of wine that we definitely shouldn't have finished between us. We were looking through recent case files when she pulled out an envelope I hadn't seen before. "This came through the National Center for Missing Persons last week. she said, her expression unusually serious. "I wasn't sure if I should show it to you, but I think you have a right to know." Inside was a letter from Patricia McKay Williams, a second cousin I had never known existed. Patricia was 85 years old and living in Portland, Oregon, where she had spent 60 years as a public school teacher. She was the daughter of Ruth McKay Joseph's older sister, who had moved to Oregon in the 1940s after learning about her brother's crimes. "I am writing this letter," Patricia began in careful cursive, "because I am dying of cancer and I refuse to take family secrets to my grave. My mother made me promise never to speak the McKay name outside our immediate family, but I have spent my entire adult life wondering if any of my Kansas relatives survived the poverty and violence that drove us all apart." Patricia's letter included a family tree that extended back to our great-great-grandparents, showing connections I had never imagined. More importantly, it included contact information for 23 other McKay descendants scattered across the western United States, teachers, nurses, mechanics, farmers, and small business owners who had all been living with the shame of Joseph's crimes and the burden of enforced family silence. "We have been holding annual reunions in Oregon for the past 15 years. Patricia continued, "Just Ruth's descendants and the few cousins we could track down. But we have always known there were family members unaccounted for, people whose stories were lost when Joseph's crimes scattered us to the winds. We would very much like to include Margaret's line if you are interested in connecting with family who share your blood but not your trauma. Tomorrow I will call Patricia for the first time. Next month, Rebecca and I will fly to Oregon together for my first family reunion in 60 years. We will meet cousins and second cousins and great-nieces and great-nephews who carry the McKay name without shame, who have built lives of purpose and meaning despite the shadow cast by one evil man's choices." As I finish writing this account, the sun is setting over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that remind me why I chose to spend my final years in the place where everything began. The 12-year-old girl who was assaulted in Memorial Park in 1962 could never have imagined that her story would end with family reunions and meaningful work and the quiet satisfaction of justice served. But perhaps that's the most important lesson I learned from surviving Joseph McKay's cruelty trauma. Doesn't have to define the ending of your story. It can become the beginning of something else entirely, something that honors both the pain of the past and the possibilities of the future. Joseph thought he could break me, could use my body as a weapon against my family's happiness and my own potential for healing. He was wrong about everything that mattered. In the end, his legacy was contained within prison walls and then a grave, while mine continues to grow with every cold case Rebecca and I solve, every family we reunite, every person who finds courage in our story to speak their own truth. The show that began in Memorial Park in 1962 truly ended in a Kansas courtroom in 1990, but the life that emerged from its ashes is still being written. And for the first time in my 75 years, I am genuinely excited to see what comes next.